Hi friends, continuing to the chapter, the psychology. Questioning manner method. While the interview method and the clinical method is very useful in the testing individual, it is the questioning manner method that it is chosen for a group investigations. A questionnaire is a means of presenting a series of standardized stimuli to elicit the certain kinds of responses. It is highly standardized instrument and not a mere assemblage of a question to collect the informations. Its aim is generally to discover the perfections of an individual. In the use of these procedures, the emphasis is upon attributing the responses to some conditions with the individual which is more or less enduring in nature. This is to say that the responses are elicited and studies as indicated of some fundamental prepositions with the individual which functions as determiner of his preferences. The questionnaires method has been extensively used to ascertain in the public opinion. Government as well as the business and the industry have been making use of this method to access the opinion. Considerable amount of an research work have been done regarding the framing of the questions, sampling, analysis of data and the other aspects. Two principal types of an questions used are the pool questions and the open-ended questions. The pool questions is provided with a set of an alternative answers and the respondent chooses one of them. Say for an example, caste systems should be, remain, be modified, be abolished. In all such questions, the respondent is required to choose one of the standard alternatives. The pool questioning developed naturally out of the methodology of the psychophysics in the experimental laboratory and out of an psychological testing, in both of which the subject was called upon to respond in the terms of an fixed categories, higher or heavier in the weight comparisons, yes or no on the test forms. On the other hand, the open-ended questions is framed to elicit a free responses without providing any alternate responses. Say for an example, what do you think of an current ruling party of the state? Or what do you think that the government should do to settle the Kashmir problem? The significant features of such questions is that the respondent is free to answer as he pleases. The pool questions came out of an experimental and testing laboratory. The open-ended question may be said to have developed from the psychological clinic. But the advantages of the pool type questions is that the response may be tabulated easily. It admits of an quantitative and statistical treatment which of immense help to understand the problem under investigations. We may now refer briefly to the fundamental problems of sampling. Obviously, we cannot study the whole population. Like example, the census in India, once in 10 years, when every family and every individual in the country is enumerated. This is a very difficult and costly method of the study. That is why the central government has now established the National Sample Survey Unit, which studies a small but very representative samples as frequently as possible. This is a method which your mother uses when she is cooking a pot of rice or dal. When she started to find if the rice is cooked, she take a ladle, stirs up the whole pot and then take a few grains and test whether they are cooked. If they are cooked, she infers that the whole quantity is cooked. Otherwise, she let the pot boil for more time. This is a method which the engineer uses. He wants to study the strength of some materials used and what the doctor used to determine the blood count of a patient. Only samples are studied. We must find first known what the population we are studying. All people in a city or in the state or the country, or only some people like unskilled laborers or the business community or the college students, etc. After defining the population, the next step is to get the right sample from the population. The fundamental requirement is that the sample should be presentable, unbiased. Example, statistic check computed on the basis of an male questionnaires are subjected to bias. Those who reply male questionnaires are not typical of the group. Random sampling procedures where every person of the population has a must chance of being included as any others or satisfactory, but this is a highly technical problem. The sample may have to be straighter, random sample when example it has to include the people of an various occupation and educational level. Obviously, a sample from the professional group cannot be a proper sample of all the adults. Mere size of a sample will not guarantee its adequate. The chief minister or the prime minister may get hundreds of the letters and the telegrams in favor of a legislative proposal or against it. This may be a biased sample. There are thousands who had not expressed their opinion by the letters or telegrams. They may think otherwise. Further, the precision of a sample does not increase the proportionality with the size of the example or sample. It is only increases in the proportion to the square root of the number of the cases. Say for an example, in the US, a small, carefully stratified samples of 200 people in the New York state predicated the results of a state government's election just as well as a sample of 2,800 or 48,000, while the number of the people who actually voted was more than 4 million. Finally, we may indicate briefly the uses of the breakdowns in the analysis of the responses to the questionnaires. The percentage of the responses of the whole group reveals some characteristics. The psychological and the sociological determinants of opinion can be obtained by the breakdowns technique. By getting the percentage of the responses of an subclasses on the basis of an age, sex, education, income, caste, etc. What kind of a breakdown is used depend on the particular hypothesis to be tested. The breakdown is one of a few tools which provide an approach to the problem of an questions. It gives us a method of an attack on the questions of an relative importance of two or more variables. It is also furnishes a foothold for a study of an stimulus relationship between the variables when the opinions are held constant. Scaling method. Several methods have been evolved to measure the attitude which play such as important parts in the social interactions. Attitudes are more or less enduring the organization of an perpetual motivation and emotional process. They involve an example of an certain kind of an experiences on the one hand and a certain readiness to response on the other. But they cannot be observed, so they can be measured only indirectly. Measurements requires a scale. In instance, the method of scaling requires that the individual reacts verbally with the expressions of the approval or disapproval, agreement or the disagreement to a session of a carefully standardized item or the proportions. The pattern and the summations of the reaction to the set of an items provides a way of inferring the individual opinion or attitude considering the objects to which the item refers and permit the individual to be assigned a position along a quantitative scale of a proneness or the corness. There are many methods to prepare the scales, but essentially they involve the assignment of a particular position to give the individual along a continuum indicating the approval or disapproval. From the pattern of a statements endorsed by the individual, we can infer whether he is favorable, neutral, or unequal appearing unfavorable towards the topic investigated. Thrustone, 1929, made us of the methods of the equal appealing intervals to prepare the scale. Likert in 1932 made us of the methods of summutated ratings. Gulified 1931 made us of a method of paired comparison to prepare a scale regarding nationality. During the Second World War, Gutzman 1941 used the scaleogram device for accentuating the degree of an constituency. Bogratz in 1925 devised what is sometimes called the group order methods to measure the attitudes towards the nationalities. This method has been adopted in our country to measure the attitudes towards the various castes and the creeds. All these methods involve very careful sessions of the test items. The method followed by the Thrustone involves the using of the judges and then preparing the scales. Experimental method. The experimental method involves the isolation, variation and repletions. It involves the controls of the conditions by the experimenter. The experimenter observes accurately what happened under certain known conditions. It is obviously that the problem of social interactions are very complex. Consequently, it is very difficult to control the conditions. Often, it is difficult to ascertain the exact contribution of each conditions. In spite of this limitation, several carefully planned researches have been conducted. When have now considered a body of a knowledge concerning the social interactions on the basis of an experimental work. The experimental research has given us some insight into the techniques of the social control. The growth of our insight in the social psychology as a result of certain laboratory experiments on the group panic, on the democratic authorization and laissez-faire leadership, on a group frustrations, on the operation of an prejudice in voting, etc., lead us to the conviction that this same sprout will take place in the development of a systematic social psychology of an group behavior. The method generally used in the social investigation is the control group method. The two groups, a control group and an experimental groups, are used. As far as possible, these two groups are evaluated in the number, sex, education and other variables. Sometimes intelligence test, attitudes test, interest test and such other tests may be used to evaluate the two groups. Then they are subjected to unequal stimulation. One group may be exposed to a particular stimulation while the other is not. The two groups are tested again and the result in equalities in performances or interest or attitudes are attributed to the various introduced. Ask a question, then research for it, then hypothesis, then test with an experiment. Analyze your result in two different ways. Hypothesis is true and the hypothesis is false. Then report your results. This is the experimental method. When it is not possible to secure two initially equal groups, we can measure the effects of an changed condition on the basis of a difference between the initial and the final performance of the same group. If we want to study the effect of an propaganda, we may, for instance, take a group, give it an attitude test to find the initial performances, then expose the group to the propaganda, finally give the attitude test once again and see if the propaganda has any effect. There are many ways of designing the experiments to suit the particular problem and the group available. If we want to know the effects of propaganda against war, we may give a test to the measures the attitudes towards war. On the basis of this test, we can take one group that it is moderately pacific and another that it is moderately militaristic. After exposing the two groups to propaganda, we may again measure the attitude and determine the effects of propaganda against war on the pacific and militaristics. We may also refer here to the important experiment designed by Sharif in 1936 to determine the way in which the social norms operates. Making use of an autokinetic effect and by introducing the social factors, Sharif demonstrated that the range and the norms of an different individuals working at the same time coverage. This works in effects is a study of information of a norms in laboratory situation. It showed the basic psychological processes involved in the establishment of the social norms. Long ago, F. H. Allport in 1924 introduced experimental method to study the influence of a presence of the others on one's performance. He showed that the effects of what he called the social facilitation. He studied the quality and the quantity of the output when an individual worked alone and when he worked with the others. Even as early as 1920s, he found that the individuals making the judgment of the pleasantness and the unpleasantness of order tends to avoid the extreme judgment when they are in the presence of others, whereas they tend to give the extreme judgment when they are tested once. Social facilization, other presence to an arousal, then to strengthen dominant responses into two parts, enhancing easy behavior, then impairing different behavior. Doing research ethically. As researchers, social psychologists confront ethical issues. For instance, is it ethical to expose experimental participants to a treatment that it is embarrassing or has potentially harmful effects on their self-concept? If such research is important, what are the rights of the person? What are the ethical obligations of the researchers? And what guidelines are there for deciding? A question of an ethic arises most often in the psychological experiments, but they can also confirm the non-experimental researchers. For example, if you were a professional observer of a crowd behavior and witnessed a violent assault, or you ethically obliged to do at least try to intercept. It is not only the social psychologists who must think this kind of a problem through. The journalists, doctors, lawyers and the counselors live with the professional ethical issues as well. To guide researchers, the American Psychological Association established in 1972 and update periodically a set of principles for the ethical conduct in the research involving the humans in Western countries, universities do not permit researchers to go ahead until unless it has been checked to conform to these principles. There are five ethical principles that have received the most attention: protection from the harm, rights to privacy, deceptions, informed consent, and debriefing. Although it is pretty obvious that you should not harm your participants, much hinges on what it is defined as harm. Splinters under the fingernails is clearly a harm. But what about telling the participants they have done badly on a word association task? It may have a long-term effect on the self-esteem and could therefore be considered harmful. But on the other hand, the effect may be as minor and transitory as to be insignificant. Privacy is more straightforward because research participants often gives the personal information and sometimes embarrassing and initiate information. Researchers do their best to ensure confidently so that the data cannot be traced back to the individual participants. Perhaps the most contentious issues is the use of deception in experiments. In experiments, the participants needs to be unaware of an manipulations and hypothesis being tested. Otherwise, data would be reflect deliberate responses rather than automatic reactions, and it would be impossible to study many psychological processes. Because the use of an deception seems to be empathy, trickery, deceit, and lying, it has attracted a frenzy of an criticism. Ignited in the early 1960s by Diana in 1964, attacks on Stanley Milgrams in 1963, studies of an destructive obedience. Social psychologist has been urged to the abandon experiments altogether in the favors of the stimulation or the role playing exercises. This is clearly too extreme, as a social psychological knowledge has been enriched enormously by the classic experiments that has used the deceptions. Altogether, some experiments have been excessive deceptions. In practice, the deceptions used in the overwhelming majority of the social psychology experiments is trivial. For example, an experiment may be introduced as a study of a group decision making when in the fact it is a part of a program of a research to prejudice and stereotyping. In addition, no one has yet shown any long-term negative consequences of the uses of a deception in the social psychological experiments, and the experimental consequence of the uses of the deception in the social psychological experiments, and the experiment participants themselves tends to be impressed rather than upset or angered by clearly executed the deceptions, as they view the deception as a necessary withholding of information or as necessary tricks. One way to safeguard the people right in the experiment to tell them the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth about the experiment, and they are free to withdraw any point and obtain in writing the informed consent to practice. In practice, however, the full information can be difficult to define, and as we have just seen, experiments often requires some deception in order that the participants remains naive. Participants should also be fully debriefed after taking the part in an experiment. They should learn all about the research and the research producers so that they leave the laboratory with an increased respect for an understanding of the social psychology. Most psychological social researchers is either correlational or experimental. Correlation studies sometimes conducted with the systematic survey methods. Discriminate the relationship between the variables, such as between the amount of an education and amount of income. Knowing two things are naturally related is variable information, but it is not an reliable indicator of what is causing what or whether a third variable is involved. When possible, social psychologists prefer to conduct the experiments that explores the causes and the effects. By constructing a miniature reality that it is under their control. Experimenters can vary one thing and then the another and discover how those things separately or in the combination after behavior. We randomly assign participant to an experimental conditions which receives the experimental treatments or to control the conditions which does not. We can then attribute any resulting differences the two conditions to the independent variables. In creating the experiments, social psychologists sometimes stage situations that enhance the people's emotions. In doing so, they are obliged to follow the professional ethical guidelines such as obtaining the people's informed consents, protecting them from the harm, and fully disclosing afterwards and temporary deceptions. Laboratory experiments enable social psychologists to test the ideas gleaned from the life experiences and then to apply the principles and finding to the real world. Observational method. It is a research method used to collect the data by observing the relevant behavior of a sample at a specific time interval for the purpose of the analysis. Development method. It is similar to the observational method where the development of the social behavior of the children are observed. Interviewer method. It is a face-to-face data collection method to collect the large amount of a data where the psychologist asks the sample a set of questions and can be explored the questions in the depth to get more valid data. Clinical method. It is observation and the examination for the diagnosis purpose of an individual. It is usually a combination of an testing, interview and the case history. Scaling method. It is used to measure the amount of an attribute of interest of a person using the scale. Experimental method. To use to establish causes and effect relationship. The experimenter creates a conditions of one variable to observe the offer of a change in another variables. Social motives, attitudes and learning in the social context. The process of the socialization to be determined by the motivational process. Thus, it is important to study the social motives which relates with the social psychology. This lesson teaches you the nature, relationship, functions and the components of an attitude which are cognition, evolution and behavioral predictions. It also discusses about the learning which affects the attitude formation. After completing your studies of this lesson, you should be able to understand the roles of a social motives and behaviors, define attitude and understand its nature, identify the components of an attitude, describe the relationship between the components of attitude, identify how attitudes are reinforced through the learnings, understand the functions of the attitudes, describe how imitation influences the attitudes, the plans of studies, social motives and behaviors, attitudes, natures of attitudes, components of attitudes, into four parts: cognition, evaluation, behavior predictions, relationship among the concepts, attitude, reinforcement and learning, social motives and behaviors. It is now generally agreed that the experience and the behavior are the outcome of internal as well as external stimuli factors which are operating at the given time. It is further generally agreed that the behavior is a goal director motivator. The whole process of socialization depends upon the motivational process. The parents, as well as the others who are in the charge of children, build up the socialization process wittingly or unwittingly on the basis of motivation. So, it is necessary for us to study these problems of motivation in relation to the social psychology. The term insist has gone out of an usage because in the behavior of a man there is a problem of training on the one hand and adjust on the other. Consequently, no act of behavior can be looked upon as intensive in the sense that it is just a complicated psychological responses to a particular stimulus situation. The contrary view that the nature of the reaction is dependent on the properties of the stimulus is also rejected, as this does not help us to understand the social phenomena. It is now realized that the behavior is based on internal as well as external factor, that the behavior is biosocial, involving biological factors as well as social influences. The term needs, urge, motives are now used to describe such international philosophical factors which are the basics of behaviors. It is further realized that these motives, which are to start with the biogenic, are affected by the social factors. Say for an example, to you it biogenic, but how we eat is a sociogenic. Similarly, what we eat and where we eat, or these are conditioned by the group in which we have been brought up. Our attitudes towards our own way of eating and dressing, our attitudes towards a way of eating of other people, or the products of socialization. There is nothing natural in one way of eating or another way of eating. It is purely a matter of a group in which we have been brought up. Many motives of man are the products of social interactions. Thus, the motives as we find them operating among the human beings around us are both biogenic as well as sociogenic. We find that a good deal of learning is at the basic of our motivator activities. It must be realized that the motivation is concerned concept in order to explain the behavior that can be observed and described. It is an interference based on our observation of the behavior of animal and the human beings under the conditions of everyday life as well as under the experimental conditions. The rat which is hungry will learn to go through a maze and obtain its food. A rat which has been fed may go through the maze, but its learning will be very slow. Consequently, we infer that there is some tension in the organism which arises out of the deprival of food. The energetic action of the organisms, its goal-directed activities, its variability and its persistence, and the way in which it active cases when it consumes the food, all these lead us to infer that the behavior of the rat is motivated by hunger. Behavior is looked upon as an activity which arises where there is a state of tension in the organisms, and the activity itself is looked upon as the tension reducing. If the organisms is not allowed to move about it, it became more and more restless, more and more active where it is. When the activity lead to the reaching of the particular goal, then the organism became quiet. This kind of motivational behavior, as we have seen, is not only based upon the psychological drives, but it is also based upon the drives which are of social origins. A man struggles to obtain the food, clothing, and the shelter not only for himself but for his family, where These minimum requirements are obtained. He does not stop working. His restlessness does not cease with the provision of minimum requirement. He wants to be like his neighbors with the better food to eat, better clothes to wear, better house to live in. And so he works harder, earns more, and profits more. What is the limit for this? It depends upon the group in which he is living. If he is living in a village, he is quite satisfied with a little more than his neighbors. On the other hand, because in the city the neighbors have a good deal of amenities, he will have to struggle for much more. Irrespective of how much of food or clothing or a shelter a man obtains, the basic consideration is to have the same standard as his neighbors or better standards than his neighbors, where it is the village or in the city. Consequently, the psychological motives do not operate purely at the somatic level. They work within the given cultural settings. Attitudes. An attitude is a predisposition to respond to a particular object in a generally favorable or unfavorable way. A person's attitude influences the way in which he or she preserves and responds to the world. We have two kinds of attitudes, positive attitude and the negative attitude. For example, attitude influences the attention. The person who's like the traditional classical music is more likely to notice the new stories about the traditional classical musician and the program activities. Attitudes also influences the behavior. The person who opposes the drinking age law is more likely to violate it because attitudes are an important influences on the people. They occupy a certain place in the social psychology. A particular attitude does not exist in isolation. The person who believes that the government spending causes inflation has a whole set of beliefs about the role of government in the economy, and its attitudes about spending is related to those other beliefs. And if attitudes influences the behavior, perhaps we can change the behavior by changing the attitudes. How? Then do attitudes change? Politicians, auto manufacturers, and brewers spend the millions of dollars every year trying to create a favorable attitudes. Even if they succeed, do their attitudes affect our behavior? We shall consider the three main questions here. First, what is an attitude? Where do the attitudes come from? And how are they formed? Second, how are the attitude linked to other attitudes? How does this organization affect the attitude change? Third, what is the relationship between attitudes and behavior? Nature of the attitudes. An attitude exists in a person's mind. It is a mental state. Every attitude is about something, the object of the attitude. We shall here consider the components of an attitude, the source of an attitude, and their functions. Components of an attitude. Consider the following statement. My human sexuality class is really boring. This attitude has three components. First, beliefs or conjectures. Second, an evolution. Third, a behavior predisposed positions. Conjunction. An attitude includes an object label, rule for applying the label, and a set of conjunctions or the knowledge structures associated with the label. The person who doesn't like his or her human sexuality class preserves it as it's involving the certain content thought by a particular person. Often we cannot prove whether the particular benefits are true or false. For example, economists and the social government officials disagree on whether the government spending that causes inflation with the both sides equally convinced they are right. Second, the evolution. An attitude also has an evaluative or affective components. Its boring indicate that the course arouses a mildly unpleasant emotion in the speaker. Strong negative emotion include dislike, hatred, or even loathing. I can't stand rock music. Of course, the evolution may be positive. I like Carnatic music, or this food is terrific. The evaluative components has both the direction positive or negative and an intensively ranging from a very weak to the very strong. The evolution components distinguished an attitude from other types of conjunctive elements. Behavior predispositions. An attitude involves a predisposition to respond or behavioral tendency towards the object. It's boring implies a tendency to avoid the class. I like my job suggests an intention to go to work. People having a specific attitudes are inclined to behave in a certain way that are consistent with that attitude. Relationship among the components, conjunctive, evolutive, and behavioral components all have the same objects. So we would expect them form a single, relatively consequent whole. However, these three components are distinct. If they were identical, we would not need to distinguish among them. Thus, we should be able to measure each components and we should be able to find the relationship among them. A survey of an woman's attitudes towards a contrast, for example, found the belief, feelings, and the actions are both distinct and somewhat related. The degree of an constituency between the components is related to the other characteristics of the attitudes. Greater constituency between the conjunctive and affective components is associated with the greater attitude stability and the resistance to the precautions. Greater constituency is also associated with the stronger relationship between the attitude and the behavior. Attitude reinforcement and the learning. Where do the attitudes come from? How are they formed? The answer lies in the process of social learning or socialization. Attitudes may be formed through the reinforcement, that is instrumental condition, through the associations of the stimuli and the responses, classical conditioning, or by observing others, that is observational learning. We can acquire an attitude towards our classes and jobs through the instrumental conditioning, that it is learning based on direct experiences with the object. If we experience rewards related to some objects, our attitude will be favorable. Thus, if a work provides us with a good pay, a sense of an accomplishment, and a complaint from our co-workers, our attitudes toward it will be quite positive. Conversely, if we associate negative emotions or unpleasant outcomes with some objects, we will dislike it. For example, repeated exposures to bland, overcooked food lead many students to have a very negative attitude towards the mess food at the hostels. Only a small portion of our attitudes are based on the direct contacts with the objects. However, we have attitudes about many political figures we have never met. We have an attitude toward the members of certain ethnic or religious groups, although we have never been face to face with a member of those groups. Attitude of these types are learned through our interactions with the third parties. For one, we learn attitudes from our parents as a part of a socialization process. Researchers shows that the children's attitudes toward the male or female relation, a divorce, and the politics frequently are similar to those held by their parents. This influences also involve instrumental learning. Parents typically reward the children for adopting the same or similar attitudes. Friends are another important sources of our attitudes. The attitudes that the drinking age law is unfair. Say, for an example, it may be learned through the interaction with the peers. We acquire the attitudes and prejudices towards a particular group through the classical conditioning, in which a stimulus gradually elicits a response through a repeated associations with other stimuli. Children learn at an early age that lazy, dirty, stupid, and many other characteristics are undesirable. Children themselves are often punished or being dirty, or hear the adult says, "Don't be stupid." If they hear their parents or others refers to the members of a particular group as lazy or stupid, children increasingly associated the group name with the negative reactions initially excited by these terms. Several experiments have shown that the classical conditions can improve the negative attitude towards the group. Another source of an attitude is the media, especially the television and the films. Here, the mechanism may be observing listening. The media provide an interpretative packages of a frames object about an object that may influence the attitudes of viewers and readers by portraying the events and the actors in a certain way. TV news, news magazines, and the newspapers can produce a conjunctive images of a racial group as being volatile, dangerous, or unreasonable that in the turn produces a negative attitude. The function of the attitudes. We acquire an attitude through the learning. But why do we retain them? Sometimes for the month, years, or even a lifetime. One answer is that they serves at least some important function for us. The first is a heuristic or the instrumental function. We develop a favorable attitude towards the object that the aid or reward us, and unfavorable attitudes toward the object that frustrate or punishes us. Once they are developed, attitude provide a simple and efficient means of evaluating the objects. Business people learn that the Republican politician frequently propose and vote for the legislation that benefits the business. Learning that a new candidate is a Republican, the business person immediately has a favorable attitude. Second, attitude serves a systematic or knowledge function. Because the world is too complex for us to completely understand, we group the people, objects, and events into a categories or the schemas and develop simplified, that is, stereotyped attitudes that allows us to treat the individual as the members of a category. Our attitude about that the category provide us with the meaning, with the basic for making inferences about its members. The belief in the Western culture that blacks are untrustworthily leads some whites to be guarded in their interaction with the blacks. Reacting to every members of a group in the same way is more efficient, even if a less accurate and satisfying than trying to learn, but each person has an individual. Stereotypes of a groups are often associated with intensive emotions. A strong like or dislike for members of a specific group is called as prejudice. Prejudice and the stereotype go together with the people using their stereotyped belief to justify prejudice towards the member of the group. The emotional component of the prejudice can lead to the intergroup conflict. Third, attitudes define the self and maintain the self-worth. Some attitude express the individual basic values and reinforce his or her self-imagine. Many political conversities in our society have a negative attitudes towards abortion, racial integration, and equal rights for women. Thus, a person whose self-concept includes conservations may adopt these attitudes because they express the self-imagine. Some attitudes symbolize a person's identification with or the membership in particular group or subcultural. The attitude guns don't kill the people, people kill people is widespread among the members of National Rifle Association. Holding these attitudes may be both a pre-acquitus to accept by the other group members and a symbol of an loyalty to the group. Finally, some attitudes protect the person from recognizing certain thoughts or feelings that threaten his or her self-imagine or adjustment. For instance, an individual, say as Tom, may have a feeling that he cannot fully acknowledge or accept, such as hostility towards his father. If he recognized this hostility, he would feel very guilty because such sentiments are contrary to his upbringings. So instead of acknowledgement that he hates his father, Tom may direct anger and hatred toward the members of a minority group or towards the authority figures such as police officers or the teachers. Researchers indicate that the experiments that threaten a person's self-esteem, such as a failing a test, leads to more negative evaluation of the other groups, particularly among the people whose self-esteem was initially high. Attitude formation. Right from our birth onwards, we are exposed to be a wide diversity of stimuli, both directly and indirectly, which leads to our acquiring sculptures attitudes toward the attitudinal object. It is whispered attitudes are true and large acquired as a result of several life experiences. Although a small but rising body of a proof design that the attitudes may be influenced through the genetic factors too. A number of theories has been used to identify what leads to formation and maintenance of the attitudes. Classical condition. Process of classical condition was first described through Pavlov. In his experiments on the dog, he found that after repeated pairing of an unconditional incentives, that is example Bill, with a conditional incentive, that is dog, the latter acquires the capability to evoke an conditional response, that is salvation, similar to the old. Unconditional responses, salvation. It has been suggested that in the same method that a bell can evoke a psychological response, classical conditioning can produce a positive or negative attitudes towards a previously neutral object. Arthur and Clarence state in 1958 were two of the first researchers who systematically studied the classical conditions of the attitudes. They mannered an experiments in which the goal was to condition positive and the negative attitudes to the names of the countries, Sweden and Holland, which previously were regarded neither positively or negatively. Throughout 108 conditioning trials, two nationalities were always followed through a negative word. Example, failure. Two were paired with the positive adjectives. Example, happy and give. And two others were paired with neutral words. Example, table. At the end of the experiment, it was indeed found that the particular held more positive attitudes toward the nationality associated with the positive words and more negative attitudes towards those associated with the negative words. Classical conditioning could play a role in establishing some of the emotional concept of the attitudes and prejudices. Further, through the classical conditioning, people may come to have a powerful adrenal reactions to the social objects even in the absence of a first-hand experiences. Hence, the children who hear repeated pairing of a word in their parents' conversation, such as says, Muslims are aggressive, Muslims are fundamentalist, throughout this early years of development may come to adopt such negative attitudes themselves without even meeting them. Instrumental conditioning. Child, Mummy, doesn't Mossy look nice in her green dress? She really knows how to carry herself. Mother, you're absolutely right, dear. I have felt that for some times now. I was hoping you would agree. Your dress sense is really getting evolved. You can now suggest me what to wear after the time we go out. This kind of conversation illustrate quite clearly that the role of reinforcement in the attitude formation. Following her mother's argument, it is likely that the children's initial response of a positive attitude is relation to the Mossy will be reinforced. Of course, had the child remarked that the Mossy looks awful, the mother might have reacted with a displeasant there by pushing the remark. Following reward, the child's attitude is likely to be strengthened, whereas the punishment would almost certainly lead to weakening of the attitudes. This is a process of an instrumental condition, a basic form of learning studies through the Thorndike in 1911 and Snicker in 1938. According to these behaviors that are followed through a positive outcomes tends to be strengthened, while those are followed through the negative outcomes are suppressed. The degree to which the attitudes are verbally or non-verbally reinforced through others will affect the acquiring and maintenance of the attitude. For example, early in your life, if your parents and the teachers praised you for doing well in studies, you may have doubled your efforts and urbanized a positive attitudes toward the studies. Though if your friend parent did not acknowledge her achievement in studies, she would have almost certainly urbanized a negative attitude towards the studies. Genetic factors. Some research designate that our attitudes, at least a tendency to develop a certain views in the relation to the various topics or the issues, are inherited. For instance, Avery et al. In 1989 studied the level of job satisfaction of 34 set of an identical twins separated from each other at an early age and found that almost 30% of the job satisfaction appears to be explainable through the genetic factor. Teaser in 1993 has urged that hereditary variables may affect the attitude but believes that they may do so indirectly. Additional research suggested that the genetical factors play a strong role in shaping some attitudes than the others. For example, attitudes involving gut level performances, say a preference for a certain kind of food, may be more strongly influenced through the genetic factors than attitudes that are most conjunctive in the nature, says the attitude towards environmental conversation. Thank you.